It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Sudhir. Sudhir, how do you pronounce your last name? Sorry.
Perincheri, that's okay.
Perincheri, sorry. Dr. Sudhir Perincheri. And he originally got his medical degree from India and come to United States right after that for the PhD program in the molecular biology at the University of Kentucky. And then he goes through the traditional route doing the postdoc research at the Columbia University, also in the Department of Genetics Development. And all of a sudden, I don't know why he switched his route to the postdoc fellow at the Yale for the medical informatics. Probably that's the route for his talk today, talk about the digital pathology. Since then, he's very loyal to the Yale, and he stayed there, continue as a residence and 2 fellowship, one for the hematopathology fellowship, and the other one is combined, the renal pathology and the GU pathology fellow. And since then, he stayed at the Yale as a faculty, and right now he's assistant professor, and his service covered the hempath and renal and GU. And in addition to that, he also has a big job to do, is to develop digital pathology. So that's what we are going to hear today from Sudhir. Okay, Sudhir, and it's very nice to have you, and please take away.
Thank you, Minghao, for that very kind introduction. So as Minghao said, it's an honor to present the grand rounds in front of you today. And I took his suggestion when he invited me to narrate the story of our experiences here deploying digital pathology to enhance our clinical workflows. But before I go into the meat of my talk, I have no personal disclosures. That said, any talk with that deals with digital pathology will invariably have mention of vendors and platforms and software platforms and so forth. And to the extent they are mentioned in this talk, it's not an endorsement. It's just a statement of fact where, for various reasons, sometimes practical, sometimes not so much, we chose that platform for use here. And at the end of my talk, if time permits, I'll share some data about a project that I did with Rick Torres, who was then at a faculty in laboratory medicine here using multiphoton microscopy. Rick has since spun that technology into a startup called Applicate Technologies, but I have no financial stake in that company. Also, as you all are aware, any talk about digital pathology is really a narrative of a team effort, and I am just a spokesman for a large team. A lot of the work here that I'm presenting today was developed under the leadership of our clinical informatics division that is headed by John Sonar and Peter Gershkowitz. And they have a team of software engineers, and 3 of them whose work is being displayed today are Joe Solano, Neil Mutnick, and Kevin Chiepo. So I think all of us have now sat through some presentation at a conference where someone goes over a large-scale deployment of digital pathology in a large center with satellite hospitals. I can't recall the last time it was at USCAP or API or PathVisions where there wasn't one such version of a talk. And usually it delves into how they had a huge bolus of money, they got a ton of scanners, they deployed it, the business case, the ROI, efficiency gains, and so forth. And I'm told Dr. Parwani is visiting you at the end of the week, and you will hear, I think, one such narrative from him, which is going to be a stark contrast to the story that I am presenting today. It's not only in conferences, there were also a slew of papers that have been published along these lines, and these are some that came out typically in the during the COVID pandemic. And it also highlights, I think, 2 classes of institutions that exist right now. There are those who went digital prior to COVID-19, and then there were others like us who, unfortunately, the pandemic hit at the wrong time, and so that the digital pathology plans did not go according to plan. And our narrative is somewhere along those lines. So initially, it was our hope that we would be one such center. Late last decade, we had a change of leadership here, and Dr. Chen Lu was recruited as a new chair of the department. And one of the big things on the docket was actually a large-scale deployment of digital pathology here at Yale. And with that in mind, at that time, John Senard, who was then the vice chair and director of AP, and I put together a document where we went through a framework for deployment of digital pathology here at Yale. And we went into the use cases, possible use cases, what kind of hardware it would need, scanning volume, whether we would need high volume scanners, what kind of low volume scanners, high throughput, low throughput, robotic microscopes, monitors, and so forth, and the workflow that we envisage to deploy some of these use cases. We also delved into what we would require from the software aspect in terms of image management system and viewers. And finally, we also drew up an outline of what kind of personal support would be needed. And it was our hope that that would be the framework on which we would build a large scale digital pathology deployment here at Yale. Unfortunately for us, COVID-19 happened. And what you're seeing in the slide here are some of the headlines from during the pandemic and the years that followed that highlight the financial hit the Yale New Haven health system took because of the pandemic. And we were not alone by any means. Other hospitals in the state also had suffered the same fate. And one thing that I want to sort of emphasize here is, when everyone thinks of Yale, they think of a private university with an endowment that is equivalent to a GDP of a small country. And that is in fact true. And as a department, we are part of the university. But all the clinical workflow happens in the Yale New Haven health system, which is a separate corporate entity. And all the investment in the clinical workflow actually comes from Yale New Haven Health. And so it stands to reason that when they took a huge financial hit, some of the large proposed investments had to be put on the back burner. And digital pathology deployment was one of the casualties of that. So we had to pivot from a proposed large-scale deployment to one where we would do an incremental buildup of digital pathology operations here at Yale. Now, there are some who have argued, and Dr. David Klimstra, who was chair at MSK and is now faculty here, is one of them. They have argued that when it comes to digital pathology, it's really good to be either all or none. And their rationale is, if you do a hybrid system where you have some analog and some digital workflows, you carry inefficiencies of both. So not only are you filing physical slides, paying for the personnel, paying for the storage, you're also paying for the digital operations. And bear in mind that at this current time, there is no reimbursement coming for the digital piece of the workflow. That said, not doing anything digital puts us back when compared to other comparable institutions, Ohio State, for example, MSKCC, for example. And at the same time, it also impacts recruitment across all levels. When we interview residents, fellows, and faculties, for many of them, one big question is, how far along are you on your digital journey? Because everyone appreciates that that's the future. And so I think not doing anything digital was not really an option for us. So we pivoted then to a plan where we started doing a stepwise incorporation of digital pathology in our clinical workflow. So about a couple of years ago, we obtained 2 high-volume whole slide image scanners. The platform we went with was Leica GT450, and we also got their image management system, the eSlide Manager, along with that for the image server and the image viewing aspects of it. In addition to that, we got 3 robotic microscopes with potential for remote frozen section evaluation. prior to obtaining all of this hardware, we actually did pilot evaluations, and part of the reason to do the pilot evaluation was to see if we like the product, the test of the hardware, and so forth. But at the same time, there was also the second piece where the information technology people looked at the security aspects of it. And indeed, there were platforms that we actually liked from the department side that were a no-go because hospital IT was not happy with the security aspects of those platforms. We live in a world, I think, where we are used to buying very high and electronic equipment, and we just plug and play. You do an initial setup, and then you're good to go. Obviously, digital scanners don't fall into that category. There is an initial heavy lift where they have to be installed within the hospital firewall. They have to be hooked up to the image server and so on. And once that was done, we went through a phase where we had to do a lot of troubleshooting. We found that these scanners, and perhaps you have one of these and you have had similar issues, we found that though the scanners are fast and they deliver very good images, they're quite finicky and they require a lot of upfront QC/QA. The GT450 throws a bunch of errors. Some of them are because it doesn't find maybe tissue in a slide and it just scans the entire slide. So those kind of errors have less impact on workflow. But there's one particular error that is called slide handling error, which if that happens, the scanner comes to a stop. And the reasoning from the vendor is that the physical slide is at risk of being destroyed. And since that's an irreplaceable asset, if there is slide handling error, the machine comes to a stop. And a whole range of things we found can trigger these slide hanging errors. If you have overhanging labels, if you have dust or extraneous material on the slide, if you have excess mounting media, all of these trigger it. So we found that it requires a lot of upfront QA where you file the slides, get rid of the overhanging labels and dust and so forth before we load it on the machine. Independent of that, in the initial phases, we had quite a few operational issues. In fact, it triggered multiple visits from the vendors because we kept having these error messages. And for a long time, we could not figure out what was causing it. But anyway, after multiple rounds of troubleshooting, we reached a point where the slide handling errors were more of a nuisance rather than an existential crisis every day. The other thing that was happening with slide handling error was it was impacting the amount of scanning that was happening on the scanners because in a typical workflow, our scanning techs would load the scanner and they would walk away. They would, perhaps just file slides or pull slides for tumor boards and so forth, and they would come back and they would find that there was a slide handling error, and for the past hour, no slides had been scanned. And we were losing a lot of scanning time because of that. So we wrote up a custom piece of software where now if there is a slide handling error in either of the scanners, it triggers an email message to our manager of scanning operations and some scanning text, letting them know that the scanner has a slide handling error so that it can be fixed sooner rather than later. So we had to do a few rounds of this kind of troubleshooting before we got to a point where the scanners were operating in sort of a cruise control mode, which is ideally where you want to be in a clinical operation. Simultaneously, we were also looking at the image delivery aspect of digital pathology. So a lot of centers that have adopted digital pathology, I think, use the IMS to launch their images. And for a variety of reasons, eSlide Manager wasn't optimal for us. Not the least, it's because eSlide Manager was a software that is written for Windows. We are a Mac heavy department, and so the vendor sort of retrofitted it for us, and it has a lot of bugs, and we had a lot of problems with that. And so we decided we weren't going to use the vendor provided IMS to launch our images. Rather, what we wanted was a workflow that was an extension of the clinical workflow that we currently use. So in our clinical operations, we use Cernical Path, and we actually have a custom-built version of it because historically we have had access to the source code. And on top of that, we have built a web-based interface that we call Pathology Portal, which is really where a lot of our clinical workflow originates. And you can see the interface here. We log into the portal using our CoPath credentials, and we can enter in the case number, and it pulls up all the data that pertains to that particular case. It pulls up the name, it pulls up who the grossing resident was, when it was accessioned, and so forth, the part types, how many blocks, how many slides. If it came with a clinical requisition with a clinical history, it pulls that information here. If there are op nodes or imaging, it pulls it up from the EMR, which is Epic in our case, and has it ready for us to review within this interface. In addition to that, there are links where we can go into and track multiple events with the specimen. For example, when was it accessioned? Who grossed it? When did it go in the machine? When was it embedded? When did the slides come out? We can use a gross link to look up the gross description, and there's coding and all those other stuff that we basically pull from the LIS into this interface. If there are any prior specimens that pertain to that patient, that shows up here, and we can actually open these links to go into the reports of those specific cases. When it comes to trainees, if they are previewing, they can enter a provisional diagnosis here, and after the case gets signed out, they can go back and cross-check whether they were correct or not, and so forth. There are some QC tools also built in, so if there's a floater, for example, or a contaminant and so forth, we can use some of these QC tools. So a lot of our clinical workflow flows from Pathology Portal. And what we wanted to do was deliver links to whole slide images of the case within this interface. So how did we do that? Our labels that we use on our slides basically have the patient name, and then we have the case number, the part number, the block number, and the slide number. And all of this information is incorporated into a 2D data matrix code that's on the label. And so we configured the scanner to read that 2D data matrix code. And so when we scan the slide, the scanner reads that barcode and incorporates that barcode ID into the barcode ID field in eSlide Manager. So then what Pathology Portal does is it comes and cross-checks the eSlide Manager database for that case number and pulls links to all of the slides that belong to the case and makes it available within Pathology Portal. In practical terms, how does this look? So here, for example, is a case where we have one whole slide image. So it is displayed in this last column within Pathology Portal. And the way we would take a look at that would be, if we go and click that, we get a dialog box pops up. Now, if there were multiple slides in the case, it would all that have been scanned for that case, all would be listed over here. In this particular instance, there is only one case. And we have options then to either open all the images at one time, or we can select individual slides and then hit the open selected button and view them within the whole slide manager. So in practical terms, this is how the workflow looks. And it basically launches the viewer, and we can view the case, and we can go to the label and cross-check patient identifiers and so forth. So that was our image delivery solution that we came up with. So once we had that piece of the puzzle figured out, our next sort of thing that we wanted to figure out to put in place was some use cases where we could deliver whole slide images. Now, obviously, with 2 scanners, the volume is not enough to do prospective sign out. So the first use case that we settled on was scanning of external referral or consult cases. So we are a tertiary care institution. A lot of patients come here referred from peripheral hospitals, and any patient that comes here has their path reviewed. And typically what we do is we review the slides, render the diagnoses, and these slides are sent back. And we often don't have a record of what was reviewed here at Yale unless a block came and we cut an H&E from it. So scanning these slides is one way of keeping an archival record of what was reviewed at Yale Pathology. The volume is low enough that it could be accommodated with 2 scanners. And even though we don't use it for digital images or sign out right now, we use it mainly for archival purposes. Theoretically, it does not require the same rigorous validation per CAP guidelines that you would require for prospective sign out, because we are not rendering a primary diagnosis. We are only cross-checking whether our diagnosis rendered at an outside institution was correct or not. Obviously, any institution worth its salt would actually do some kind of a validation before they started using digital images for sign out. But the point here is it does not require the same level of rigorous validation that would be needed for a prospective sign out using whole slide images. There was a little bit of an engineering problem here for us. So what we wanted to do was design a label that would help us associate the case in Pathology Portal, at the same time not obscure identifiers from the referring institution. So in order to do that, we first settled on a small label, and it actually was trickier than you would think, because not all manufacturers manufacture these kind of labels. And then within that, we had to do some customization of the fonts and the 2D matrix code so that it could fit within that label. So what we do now is so before I go further, all our referral and consult cases get an X number, which is shown here. So we generate a label that has the case number and the 2D barcode, and we put it right below the slide label from the referring institution. The other thing we had to do was sort of increase the offset that the scanner looks, where the scanner looks for the case number. So typically it's configured to look only in this area for the 2D barcode. So we had to alter the metric so that it would actually look a little bit below the slide label. So what happens now is when the scanner scans this case, it sees two 2D matrix code. It sees the one from the referring institution and it sees ours. But since ours syntax is the one that matches its configuration, it assigns this case number to the slide. But at the same time, none of these features are obscured. So we can look then at all the patient identifiers from the referring institution, the patient name, for example, their case number, what kind of sample it is, if the information is there, which hospital it came for. And more importantly, if you're working with a special stain or a cytochemical stain, it does not obscure that. So that was a little bit of engineering that we needed to be able to deliver the referral images within the context of Pathology Portal. And in practical terms, this is how it looks. So here you're seeing a snapshot of a X case that has 14 whole slide images associated with it. And if you click that, the dialog box pops up, and we have the option to review all the cases or selected slides, similar to the workflow that I showed earlier on that test patient. The next thing we turned attention to was to tumor boards. So post-COVID, we do virtual tumor boards on Zoom. And typically what happens is a list of patients is circulated prior to the tumor board. We pull the slides of the presenting fellow or the attending goes through the cases, and they pick the most diagnostically relevant slides. And on the day of the tumor board, they present it to Zoom using a microscope, typically using a microscope hooked to a camera hooked to a microscope. And what we wanted to do was mimic that workflow digitally. And in order to do that, what we had to do was come up with a solution where we could assemble a tray of slides from different cases that had the most diagnostically relevant tissue. And we, again, deployed this tool within the context of Pathology Portal. Sorry. So within Pathology Portal, we added a new tab and we call it whole slide image sets. And what it does is it allows us to create slide sets where we can pick and assemble cases from slides from different cases. So for example, here you see a validation set that has 2 slides. Now let us assume that this is the slide set I'm going to use to present at a tumor board, and I want to add some different slides to this slide set. So what we would do then is go into, again, Pathology Portal, go into the case, select the slide, and then hit, instead of the open button that we would use to view the image, we hit the second button that says add to a selected WSI set. And so when that happens, we have a pop-up dialog appears. And we have 2 options at this point. We can either add it to a pre-existing set, or we can create a new set of our own. In this particular instance, like I said, let's pretend that validation set is going to be the one that's going to be present at the tumor board, and we want to add the slide to that particular validation set. So I would just go there, click it. It would give me the option. And then now when I navigate to the whole slide image sets, and I go into the validation set, you can see that slide has now been added, and then I can just launch the viewer from within that tool. And so this was the way that we deployed this solution, where we could have slides from different cases assembled in a single tray, ready to be presented at tumor board without having to go into individual cases. And I have to say, this has been one of the most successful implementations that we have done here so far. Our clinicians are uniformly happy with it. Our presenting attendings, our fellows are happy with it because they don't have to muck around with, white balance and so forth. And it has, and the other thing it has sort of done as a byproduct is helped us with advocacy with the health institution, because when the clinicians go tell the leadership that this is a good thing to have, they are more receptive to actually spending money on digital pathology. The next thing we sort of have been trying to do is do a validation studies for prospective sign out of cases using whole slide images. And what we have targeted here, we're doing it in a stepwise fashion because we do not have the capacity to do it across all services. So in the beginning, what we are doing is targeting small services, for example, the eye service, which has a low enough volume. We also have a referral/outreach GI service where we get GI biopsies from labs from the periphery. And we are doing validation studies so that we can use whole slide imaging for diagnosis in these 2 services. We are doing the validation studies using the guidelines that were published by CAP and the best practices that they recommended. And as you know, CAP recommends that for validation for an individual use case, you should have about 60 cases that represent the breadth of specimens and diagnoses that you encounter in that particular service. So it would not have escaped your attention that the whole slide image sets menu that we use for tumor boards is also perfect for assembling validation sets. And that's what we've done. We assemble 60 cases. To enable ease of review, we break them into 3 sets of 20 each. And what we do is we give the individual pathologists a Excel spreadsheet that has the case numbers, the clinical information that came with the requisition, and the part type. So for example, if they're looking at GI biopsies, the duodenum, its colon, and so forth. And the pathologist then who's doing the validation goes into that slide set, reviews the images, they enter the diagnosis. And then there is a minimum washout period of 2 weeks. They review the glass slides and do the same again, or vice versa, and then we do a concordance analysis. So the whole slide image sets that was originally designed for tumor board presentation is also what we're using for validations for sign out using whole slide images. And finally, one last use case that we deployed was immunohistochemistry positive control. So here at Yale Pathology, we do, for our IHCs, we do batch controls as opposed to on-slide controls. And the reason for that is many years ago, the volume became so much that it was not practical to have on-slide controls on each slide. So when an IHC stain is ordered on a case, there is a custom-built software that we have that we call histology asset tracking software. It adds a positive control to that particular batch. So for example, I have a case and I order a pan-keratin A1, A3, for example. HAT will look at that. It will look at the batch in which that IHC stain is going to be done. It will see whether or not there is a positive keratin control. And if there isn't one, it will add it. And when that is done, a unique barcode label is printed for that positive control side. And so the software can then match that unique barcode ID to the batch on which the IHC was done. And in this way, we can match the case with its positive control. And we provide the link to the positive control through the portal. And this is how it looks. Again, you will recognize the last column of pathology portal and the link to whole slide images. You'll see two numbers here. The first number is the slides that are from the case. The second number are the number of positive controls that are associated with that case. And when we click on that, we get this pop-up dialog. On the left column are the links to the slides from that case. And on the right are the positive controls. So for example, in this case, which looks like it was a workup for metastatic prostate cancer, this is a level that has been stained at NKX 3.1. And if I wanted to look at the corresponding positive control, I would just select that and you hit the open selected button and view the positive control. Now we move to a workflow where we scan all our positive controls up front. And what that means is that even if the IHC slide is not scanned, the positive control will show up within pathology portal. So for example, here is a renal transplant biopsy where by protocol, we do a C4D up front. And let's say I'm reviewing that, and you can see that it's not been scanned because the link is grayed out, but the positive controls show up within pathology portal. And let's say I'm looking at the physical slide, I'm looking at the C4D, and I'm wondering whether it actually worked or not. I can go into the pathology portal, look at the positive control, and cross-check. And that has been how we have delivered positive IHC controls for the last year and a half at Yale Medicine. We've coupled all of this with some real-time indexing using Elastic, where in real time we can look at the metrics of our scan volumes and so on. And there are many different ways that we can slice and dice this data. So for example, here in this snapshot, what you're seeing is our scans broken down by service over the last 2 years. And you can look at it as percentages or numbers of scan slides. We can also track by scans per month, by service, so many different ways where we can slice and dice this data. And it's helpful because if we start seeing deviations, so for example, if we had a sharp fall from 1 month to another, we go back and look at like what happened. Or if there's a sharp rise, we go and take a look at it, because right now we only have on-prem storage for whole slide images, and that fills up pretty fast. So we try to keep our scans confined to the most diagnostically relevant slides. So if we see a spike, we go in there and take a look, because we do not want this space to be used up by irrelevant material. Obviously, our hope is at some point to combine on-prem with cloud storage, in which case, at which point this will be less of an issue. But right now, this allows us to track our storage use and figure out any deviations or aberrations in our scan volumes. We also look at it at an individual scanner level. And the reason we do that is because it gives us an idea of how much excess capacity we have. So what you're seeing here in these two graphs are tracking of scans on 2 different scanners. There was a brief period where a scanner went out to the vendor for servicing, and we got a loaner instrument, and that's where you see in the graph here But what this allows us to do is actually real-time track how much excess capacity we have, and if we have to move things around, if a scanner is down, move things around, we can do that using some of these analytics. So we have coupled all of this with a lot of scanning analytics that help us in our daily workflow because we don't have much redundancy built into the system right now. We also have a custom script that runs through the database every month and it gets rid of duplicate images. So sometimes what happens is, there's an error, the scanner flags an error, the scanning tech rescans the slides, and you end up having two files from the same case residing within the database. And the script basically goes through the images, and it keeps only the latest scan and gets rid of the prior one. And that's one way we also optimize the use of storage within our system. So those are some of the use cases that we deployed using whole slide image scanners. Let me pivot here a little bit to robotic microscopes. So when we got robotic microscopes, our idea was to use them for a remote frozen section evaluation and consultation in 3 sites. So our main site is here at Yale New Haven Hospital. Bridgeport Hospital is about 20 miles down the highway, and St. Raves is about a couple of miles from the Yale New Haven Hospital. And we deployed it at these 3 centers. So we have a subspecialty service model here at Yale. And there's one person on a given day who's on call for frozen section. And that person signs out the frozen section, but if they encounter a case where they need help, they call up the subspecialty attending who's on service at that time. So for example, let's say I'm on frozen section and see a GYN specimen, and it's fairly straightforward and I feel comfortable, I'll go ahead and sign it out. But if it feels even a little bit complex, what I'll do is I'll call up my GYN colleague who's on service to take a look at it. And usually what this means is my colleague then has to drop whatever they are doing. They might be in sign out, they might be in their offices, which can be quite a walk away because we have our distribution here is quite fragmented. And they drop what they have doing and oftentimes make a long walk up to the frozen section suite and look at the case. And the idea was by deploying these robotic microscopes, they could look at it from their offices or from the sign-out areas without having to make the schlep up to frozen section suite. And again, we deployed the solution within the context of Pathology Portal. And the way it works is when we hover over our names on that interface, a drop-down menu comes up, which has links to the 3 different robotic microscopes. So in this case, let's say I want to go to one at Yale New Haven Hospital. It opens up a link. It does an initial check of whether or not we are within the firewall. It does a second check, making sure that we are at the site that we want to be, and then it takes us to the robotic microscope, and then the user can then look at the slides using the robotic microscope. So that's how we deploy that workflow. And when we did the pilot, actually, we had very enthusiastic feedback from our faculty. But unfortunately, when we actually went live with this platform, we had very poor adoption. It was virtually unused at YNHH in Bridgeport. And at the St. Raves campus, it is being used, but it's almost by mandate because we decreased our staffing at that hospital. And so there are 2 pathologists who are at Yale who actually take care of the frozen section, and they are using this platform. But it's more by mandate and less by choice. And it has been a sobering sort of experience because one thing we've realized is when you do pilots, just the sheer fact of working with a new toy brings with an enthusiasm. So you sort of have to filter that away when you make your decision of whether or not you want to adopt a platform. In this particular case, I think we've sort of figured out what the root cause is. And John Sinnott has a saying that pathologists are used to working at the speed of light, meaning that when we are at a scope, we put the slide down, we look at it under an objective, and we're already making decisions. The moment you move to a digital modality, even if it's like whole slide images, there is a lag. And this is especially true of robotic microscopes because anytime you move the objective, there's a lag. Sometimes the tissue is not completely in focus, so you have to do another autofocus, another lag. Panning the slide from one area of the tissue to the other, that's also adds a component of time into it. And when people are doing all of this under the time pressure of the turnaround time of a frozen section, I think we found that at some point people found it was easier to just make the walk up to the frozen section suite, look at it physically under scope, sign it out, rather than have to muck around with the software and the interface. And so at this point, we sort of have given up on the frozen section use case using robotic microscopes. And we asked around and we talked to some other institutions that have similar platforms. And what we are doing now is we are pivoting to use that platform for cytology, specifically for remote rapid on-site evaluation, because it looks like that's where some institutions have found traction with robotic microscopes. So we are in the middle of that process right now. Now, as with any academic medical center, we of course also have the research and education aspects of our work. And so as part of the clinical operations, the one thing we are doing now here is building up an image data bank. And this has whole slide images from different organ systems, deals with different diseases that can be linked to clinical data and outcomes. So there is stuff here that can be mined for research. In addition to that, there are unique cases that can be part of teaching sets, CMEs, publications, and so forth. As of now, if anyone wants to use these images, they have to get an IRB approval before it's given to them because there's patient metadata attached to those images. But we recognize that there are some activities, for example, teaching sets, CMEs, that do not require patient metadata. And we needed to provide a workflow where we could give de-identified images for projects that could be done under IRB exemptions. And we just had to make sure that all patient identifiers are stripped from these images. So there are various ways that patient identifiers make their way into whole slide images. Most scanners have inbuilt functionality where it scans a macro image of the slide that includes the label, and sometimes the label is imaged separately. So for example, in eSlide Manager, you have the Scout image, but you also have a separate label image. So one way, of course, to deal with this then would be to turn off that barcode label or macro image functionality within the scanner. And the resulting image would look like something like this. So here you don't see the image label, and one might be tempted to think that there is no patient identifier in this file. But that is not actually true. As long as the scanner still has the ability to read the barcode, it will often incorporate it into the file. And depending on which scanner is being used, they do it in different ways. But here is a hex dump of the image file that I showed in the previous panel. So there was no label to be seen, but if you look at the hex dump, the barcode is actually part of the file. And so there are patient identifiers that are being incorporated into the file system. So how do we deal with it? One way to do this is to just cover the slide physically so that the label information is obscured. But if the light is sufficiently strong enough and the label is not opaque, the scanner may still read that barcode and incorporate it into the file. The other way is completely turn off the barcode ID reading function within the scanner. But this is not a scalable solution for de-identification, because what it would mean is it would require duplicate scanning. We would have to scan once for clinical purposes with the slide label, and a second time with the slide label covered. And it's not really a scalable solution. Vendors will often provide de-identification solutions within their software, but they're often proprietary, and they usually cannot be applied to images from other vendors. So if you have two separate scanners from two separate vendors, chances are you won't be able to use that for de-identification. There have been approaches that have been proposed that are scalable from a software viewpoint. where the whole slide images are first converted into some format. And some people advocate for DICOM because it's the standard that has been existed in radiology for a long time. The folks that are part of the open microscopy environment recommend the UMI-TIFF format, where it's easier to decouple the identifiers and the image. However, the problem here is there is no uniform standard, and it does require an initial conversion step. So, you might be using a Hamamatsu scanner that has an NDPI. So first you have to convert it to one of these formats before you can do any of these de-identification platforms. And finally, there is a minuscule risk that image matching algorithms can take any part of a WSI, do feature extraction, and either identify or, if not, narrow down a possible patient group. And the only sort of protection against that is to just eliminate spatial data in a whole slide image. So these are the different ways where patient information can be part of a whole slide image. And so our challenge was, how do we come up with a platform that provides de-identified images to people who want to do work in an IRB, under an IRB exception? Another sort of piece of the puzzle here is, what do you use as a standard for de-identification per HIPAA standards? One could go with expert determination, where an expert applies statistical or scientific principles to sort of certify that there's a very small risk that an individual could be identified by an image. This, at least in our institution, is easier said than done, because no one seems to know who that expert should be. Even the chief information security officer of the health system balks at being designated an expert, and I think it is partly because of the individual liability that comes with it. And so we decided that was not the way to go. What we would do instead was actually use a safe harbor approach, where basically all identifiers are stripped from the image. And in order to do so, we actually teamed up with the NCI, that is funding a tool that's being developed by a company called Kitware. It actually originated from the Department of Bioinformatics at Emory University. And it has a very complicated workflow. It basically imports a file, it redacts information, it cross-checks at various points, quarantines them if there are flags, and ultimately, after multiple checks, provides a de-identified file. In addition to that, it also provides a unique ID, and therefore it can act as an honest broker. So should we ever need to go back from a de-identified image to real patient data, it can act also as an honest broker of that information. And when we put any whole slide image through the pipeline, this is what we get. So you can see here, these are the scout image, the thumbnail image, as well as the whole slide image. You can see the label has been redacted. The macro has been redacted. A custom ID has been superimposed on the file. But one of the things we found, that while it redacts a lot of the data, it does not redact the date of service, which is a potential identifier. So we modified the script now to a point where when we put images through the pipeline, the service date defaulted to the 1st of the year, 1st of January of the year. The access to the de-identification pipeline is again through pathology portal. So again, you can see this pop-up dialog box that we get through the WSI links. And here we select the slides that we want de-identified. We would click on this button that says WSI de-identify. It gives us the option of naming that particular slide whichever way we want. And what happens then is that a process is set in motion. The first thing the software does is it cross-checks, has this slide been previously de-identified? If the answer is yes, it just provides a link to that de-identified file. If not, it starts up a process where the whole algorithm redacts all the information, moves the image for storage, notifies the user via email that the de-identified slides are ready, and then shuts itself off. So why did we go into this pipeline that sort of comes up, does its work, and shut it down? It was primarily out of cost concerns. So we looked into the financial aspects of having this pipeline running 24/7 versus on demand, and what we found, or once a day. And what we found that the cheapest way to do this was actually have the process run once a day in one batch, if not on demand. But running 24/7 adds on the cost significantly. So right now, the way we have deployed the pipeline is it runs when people queue it up, it runs once a day and shuts itself off. And at the end of it, the way the output comes is a email message saying your de-identified files are ready. These are the links to your files, and this link will expire within 7 days, and tells you the time at which it expires. And so when this email comes, I can click on these links and download my de-identified files. And here is an example of a de-identified file where you can see, again, the label has been retracted. And if you do a hex dump, you'll find no identifiers in them. So what are the benefits of this approach? One is it ensures standardization and compliance because it ensures uniform application of de-identification platforms. We are currently in the validation phase of this, but the health system has been so pleased with it that they're going to mandate this as being the de-identification pipeline for anyone within the institution. It has efficiency and scalability built into it, while at the same time taking care of cybersecurity and issues and so forth, and preserving the data integrity for research. Finally, I'll take the last few minutes that I have to sort of touch a little bit on the innovation aspects of digital pathology. We are an academic center, and so we have a broad range of ongoing projects, a whole swath of them, which span from intradepartmental, interdepartmental, cross-institutional, and using a range of approaches: quantitative morphometry, multiplex immunofluorescence, machine learning, computational pathology, and so forth. And some work with non-destructive microscopy or in vivo microscopy. And so I'll just take a couple of minutes to show you some work that I did with Rick Torres, who I said before, he spun this technology off into startup. The other contributors to this were Gabriel Lerner, who was a fellow at the time and now has joined as junior faculty, and Randy Luciano. So it basically used a technique that Rick had developed with some collaborators here at Yale to use multiphoton microscopy to look at the three-dimensional histology of tissue biopsies. And this is basically the outline of the workflow. So traditional paraffin processing fixes a tissue. There's a whole series of chemical steps. We embed it in wax, trim it, section it, stain it, and then they're distributed. Whereas for multiphoton microscopy, we basically fix it. It undergoes a process called BABB clearing, and then it's basically imaged. And the principle here is that pulse lasers are used to deliver a high photon flux to a specimen. It generates then fluorescence signal and second harmonic, which can then be captured to reconstitute an image. An advantage of this technique is that the excitation is only in the focal plane, so the photo damage is minimal. But at the same time, it allows deeper imaging compared to confocal microscopy. So here is, and what the BAB clearing does is actually approximate the refractive index of proteins and membranes to the medium, so that the light diffraction that's captured by the detection lens is minimal. And then basically signal from the nuclear stain and the protein immunofluorescence is combined, and a process called inversion of logarithmic matrix conversion is used to generate a pseudo-colored H&E image. And depending on how frequently we slice through the tissue using this approach, we can do a 3D reconstruction. So what you're seeing here is a movie where a glomerulus is being reconstructed using this technology. And so in collaboration with Rick and Randy, we did a prospective study where about 45 biopsies we imaged using multiphoton microscopy using Rick's approach. And you can see here that the morphology is actually quite impressive and comparable to the H&E images. All of these have been taken using multiphoton microscopy. On the top left is what looks like to a pretty normal glomerulus. The panel on the top right shows you the classic KW nodules of a diabetic nephropathy. On the bottom left is a proliferative GN of the post-infectious GN, and you can see the neutrophils in the capillary loops. And finally, in the bottom left is a membranoproliferative GN. And so you can see the quality of the pseudo H&E images is good enough and comparable to classic H&E. And this applies also to tubulointerstitial lesions. So, for example, on the top left is a profile showing light chain crystallopathy in a patient with monoclonal gammopathy. We can look at vascular profiles and diagnose vascular pathology. The one it also throws some curveballs. So, for example, in these bottom two panels are crystallopathies. This panel is for someone who had a lot of calcium oxalate crystals. And this individual actually had a lot of calcium phosphate crystals in the kidney, and the washed out appearance is because of the way the light diffracts because of the crystals. So in our study, what we found is that we get comparable histology which is non-destructive and goes deeper into the tissue. And one advantage of this technology is not only can we give a preliminary diagnosis with non-destructive microscopy, we can then embed the tissue, put it through routine paraffin processing, and not lose any downstream ancillary tests. So we can do immunohistochemistry, we can cut H&E slides after a multiphoton microscopy. So that in a nutshell is a very high-level view of some of the digital pathology endeavors that are going on here at Yale. And if you would like some more detailed information, I'm more than happy to set up conversations along those lines, since the question is, where do we go from here? So in terms of our clinical deployment, of course, we are looking to scale up. We have some hopeful signs that the health system is finally digging itself out of the post-pandemic financial crisis. And so the idea is we'll start incorporating additional scanners. We are realistic. I don't think it'll be a huge bolus of money. I think it's more likely to be a 5-year plan that makes us predominantly, if not completely, digital at the end of 5 years. We are quite clear that we need to separate our image management system from our hardware. And truth be told, I think the market is headed that way too. It used to be that a lot of scanners would come with their own viewing software, but I think we are beginning to see that the hardware people want to just concentrate on the hardware and leave the image management part of it to the software folks. And we are seeing more and more cross-compatibility. So we think going forward, we will separate our hardware components and the image management solution. This coming year, we have plans to incorporate computer-aided diagnosis in our workflow, specifically on the GU workflow. Our senior-most GU pathologist who does the bulk of work on the service is retiring, and it's a very busy service. And we're hoping this will in some way compensate for the loss of expertise and experience. As I said before, we have given up on robotic microscopes as a solution for remote frozen section. Instead of that, there are newer platforms in the market today that are specifically catered to the remote frozen section use case. And we intend to start incorporating that for remote frozen section evaluation. And the plan with the robotic microscopes, as I said before, is just to repurpose them for rapid on-site evaluation, remote rows. And in terms of research, education, innovation, obviously all of that continues. In addition to that, we took a leaf out of the Mayo playbook. So earlier this year at the API, folks from Mayo presented a project that they did that they later published in the archives. So one thing they found is a lot of pathologists have ideas in digital pathology projects using digital pathology that they want to do, but they may not necessarily have the computational or digital expertise to do it. So they partnered with an AI company, and they facilitated and they funded some pilot projects within the department with the idea of rolling them into something bigger, at least a subset of them into something bigger. So in collaboration with Steve Kleinstein and Goriari, who are in the informatics division of our department, we are coordinating a similar endeavor here at Yale. So we sent out letters of intent, a solicitation of letters of intent for digital pathology projects, and we got some responses. What we are doing now is trying to match them with computational statistical expertise that is available within the campus and put them together. And once such teams are formed, we'll issue an RFA for pilot grants. And the idea again is that these will be seeds for larger funded grants in the future. And in this way, we'll foster both inter-institutional and cross-institutional collaborations using digital pathology. So with that, I think I have about 5 minutes left, or maybe I've completely used up that time. I'm happy to stop here and take any questions that you might have. Thank you for your time, and I hope you found it at least partly useful.
Okay, thanks, and thanks, Sudhir. That's a wonderful talk, and your experience for the digital pathology is valuable for any institute who want to implement that for the practice. So I'm going to ask the first question, and when people formulate their own questions, and just unmute yourself and ask questions. And so I think you talk about a lot of the details of the implementation. So I want to, probably you don't have time to touch anything about AI, because the digital pathology, the ultimate role is to implement AI to help us for daily practice. So based on your experience, could you share us what's the low-hanging fruits for the AI can be used practically in the next few years?
In terms of low-hanging fruit, so I think the whole issue here is the position of the FDA when it comes to LDTs and so forth. So I think in the current environment, you sort of, if you want to implement something in the clinical workflow, you're better off using solutions that are FDA approved. And in that sense, there are some solutions out there in the market that have gone through the FDA's approval process, and those are probably the ones that are easiest to deploy. Some of them certainly hold promise for increasing efficiency, for example, detection of lymph node mets, for example. And so I think those are some of the low-hanging fruit. If you really just want it to be, okay, I want to start deploying AI tomorrow. I think the long-term sort of picture is sort of a little bit more unclear to me, meaning that would it be possible for us to generate AI on our own, and what would it take for us to deploy it within our clinical workflows? And I think a lot of it depends, I think, on how the FDA how FDA's position on LDTs evolves. I think what is a little bit more concerning to me is actually the fact that we are beginning to see the test fragmentation using AI that mirrors what happened with molecular diagnostic a few years ago. So for example, in the prostate, for example, Artera AI has an algorithm that is now part of the NCCN guidelines because they proved it in clinical trial that could prove that it could provide information that's crucial to management, but that bypasses pathologists. So we have no role in that apart from providing an image to Artera for them to run their algorithm. I think that's the part that sort of worries me a little bit. But beyond that, I think right now, in terms of AI development, the best thing is the fact that many foundational models were published in the last year, and many, if not all of them, are, I think, going to be open source. And what that does is, because of that, individual institutions are not going to require huge data sets to develop their own algorithms. So there's a promise of democratization that's coming down the pipeline. But again, how that will translate into clinical tools is going to be subject to the regulatory framework, I think. So that's where I think where we are with that.
Great.
But I think these tools will keep on increasing. And regardless of FDA approval or not, when we talk to institutions that have deployed these, yeah, it's interesting. The sensitivity seems to be high, but some of the other metrics, not quite so much. And so, for example, we talked to someone to a center that's using um, the solution that we intend to use for PAGE, and they said, sorry, for prostate, and they said, oh, its sensitivity is very high, but some of its metrics, something as simple as length of tumor, it gets wrong often, which is kind of surprising to me.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. So I think your talk has a lot of information, and I think audience still need time to adjust and digest. So I have one more question if nobody else has any question. Okay, and so you started from scratch and to the almost fully implement to the clinical use, at least in certain areas. And so what's the biggest roadblocker for you, and how do you overcome for that? Or is that what's the if you starting over again, what's the things you want to do differently?
Um, I think the main sort of roadblock tends to be funding, because the whole issue with digital pathology, at least when it comes to funding from institutions, is that it's not being reimbursed. And so, there are all sorts of return on investment tools that have been published um, by the Digital Pathology Association and so forth, but none of that really gets much traction with the financial folks, because they want real hardcore dollar numbers in terms of savings and so on. So I think that really is the biggest roadblock. I think, though, the other thing that's happening is there is a lot of flux and consolidation in the market. We had to build some custom-built tools, but I think as the marketplace matures, the need for doing that will be less and less. So for example, we are at some point going to transition to Epic Beaker, and there are already image management systems in existence right now that interface with Beaker, and so the need for doing custom-built software will be less. Um, and I think we'll head more to an area where it's going to be off-the-shelf products being brought together with some, bridging. And if I had to do it again, um, I think instead of getting the robotic microscopes, I would probably have just gotten an additional scanner. And I think that's one thing we learned, like when you bring new technology in, there'll be a lot of enthusiasm, and it's really important to ask yourself, um, when I deploy it in a real world environment, how much better is my workflow going to be? And that's really the key um, uh, when you start acquiring hardware and software for this purpose.
Yeah.